So you think you know how a good story goes? A good person gets knocked down, they struggle, and then they rise up again, stronger than before. It's a nice thought, it's clean. But some stories aren't clean. Some stories are buried in mud and blood, and secrets so dark they can curdle the milk in your coffee from a mile away. This is one of those stories. It's about a woman named Ida Vaughn, who the whole town of Cedar Bluff decided to throw away like garbage. But they made one tiny mistake. They forgot to make sure she was dead first. By the time Etta Vaughn turned 39, her last name wasn't a name anymore. It was a curse. Folks in Cedar Bluff used to tip their hats when she walked down Main Street, basket on her arm, the very picture of respectability. She was the wife of Harlan Vaughn, the town's chief accountant, a man whose collars were so starched they could cut you, and whose numbers were considered more reliable than the word of God. Harlan Vaughn kept the books for every single soul in that county, the grain brokers, the dry goods stores, the church itself. In Cedar Bluff, Harlan's ledgers were the foundation the whole town was built on. And then one day that foundation cracked. It started not with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen. Red ink started appearing in Harlan's books. Rivers of it. Money vanished into thin air. Taxes went unpaid. Debts were sold to 3 different people at once. The town was bleeding out on paper, and Harlan was the one holding the knife. Before anyone could ask him why, he was gone. They found him in his office one cold March morning, slumped over his desk. A gas lamp flickered on the wall, an empty flask was clutched in his hand, and a half-written note on the desk offered no apology, no explanation, nothing. It was a perfect, tidy suicide. Too tidy. And with that, the world ended for Ida Vaughn. The town didn't just stumble, it collapsed. The school shut down because there was no money for heat. Farmers couldn't get credit for seed. The church bell, which had rung every Sunday for 50 years, fell silent. And Ada, the woman they'd all admired, became the target for all their rage. They spat on her porch. They whispered her name in the street like it was poison. The Vaughn name was scorched onto every failed business and every hungry belly in town, and Ada was forced to carry the brand. First, they took the house, then the furniture, auctioned off right there on the lawn while her old neighbors watched, the same ones who used to praise her rhubarb pie. Ada held her head high, telling herself it was just a storm that would pass, but it wasn't a storm. It was a flood, and it was pulling her under. What the town didn't take from her, sickness did. It began as a cough, a little tickle in her chest, but it didn't go away. It clung to her ribs, dug its claws in deep, and started to pull the life right out of her. Soon she was too weak to even stand. No doctor would see her without money, and the charity in Cedar Bluff had dried up the same day Harlan's accounts did. She was alone, wasting away in the dark. Well, not entirely alone. She had her daughters, Tansy and Merritt, 8 years old and identical as 2 pennies, except for a single freckle under Merritt's right eye. They were all she had left. When Ida couldn't scavenge for food anymore, the girls took over. They were like little ghosts, slipping through alleys, picking up what the town threw away. A crust of bread from the bakery's trash, a bruised potato that rolled off the grocer's cart. They brought these treasures back to their mother, who now lived with them in a broken-down tool shed behind the livery stable. A dirt floor, one tiny window too high to see out of. This was their life now, huddled together for warmth, whispering stories about the feast they'd have one day. But the town wasn't done being cruel. They wouldn't speak to the girls, wouldn't even look at them. Shopkeepers would turn their backs. If they dropped change, they'd let it fall to the dirt so the Vaughn girls would have to kneel to pick it up. Every day was a new humiliation, a fresh wound. The sickness was getting worse. Ada was coughing up blood now, her breath so shallow it barely stirred the air. The girls knew they were running out of time. They had to do something. So one sweltering July morning, they set out with a dented tin pail, heading for the hills north of town. There was a rumor, a whisper, about a man who lived out there, a recluse, a strange man who traded furs and smoked meat with the freight wagons that bypassed Cedar Bluff entirely. They said he was a wild man. Some said he was an Indian. All they knew was that he lived apart from the town that hated them, and maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't hate them too. They walked for 2 miles under a sun that felt like a physical weight, baking the dust on the road into a hard crust. When they finally reached the base of the ridge, they saw him. He was standing by a line of rabbit pelts, tall and lean, with skin the color of wet oak and long black hair tied back with a piece of rawhide. He just watched them approach, his eyes as still and gray as riverstones. He didn't seem surprised to see two little girls walk out of the wasteland. Tansy, always the brave one, spoke first. Her voice was a dry crackle. "Are you the man with the water?" He didn't say a word. He just stepped aside. Behind him was a large barrel with a dipper hanging from a nail. The girls drank, the water so cool it was a shock. It tasted like cedar and life. Merritt looked up at the silent man. "Our mama's sick," she said. It wasn't a plea, just a fact. "We need food. For her." Tansy added, "They say she ruined the town, but she didn't. It was our daddy and he's gone." The man's expression didn't change. He just stared at them with those unreadable eyes. Then he turned without a word, went into his small cabin, and came back with a strip of smoked venison and another small parcel wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Merritt. Tansy hesitated. "What do you want for it?" The man looked at her, a long, searching look. And then he spoke for the first time. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "No." That one word hung in the blistering heat. "Thank you," Merritt whispered. Tansy, still curious, asked, "What's your name?" The man's eyes flickered for a second. "Asa," he said. "Just that. Asa." As the girls turned to leave, Merritt glanced over her shoulder. Asa was still standing there, watching them go. His expression wasn't pity, and it wasn't judgment. It was just watching. And in a world that had either screamed at them or turned its back completely, just being seen felt like a miracle. They walked back to the tool shed, their arms full of meat and a strange, heavy kindness. When they got back, Ida was barely conscious, her skin waxy and pale. "Where have you been?" she whispered. Merritt knelt beside her, unwrapping the food. "We found a man. He gave us this." Ida's eyes fluttered. "What man? What name?" "Asa," Tansy said. Ida frowned. The name meant nothing to her. "Don't take things from strangers," she murmured, her voice weak. Merritt leaned in close. "He wasn't strange," she whispered. "Not like the people in town are." That night they ate the venison, chewing slowly, making it last. It was the first real meal they'd had in months. But the next day, the fever came back with a vengeance. Ida couldn't even keep broth down. The small shed felt like an oven, the air thick and suffocating. Just when Ida thought she was slipping away for good, the shed door creaked open. The girls jumped in front of their mother, ready to defend her. But it was him. It was Asa. He stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway, his shadow falling across the dirt floor. He didn't speak. He just held out a pouch made of deerskin. Merritt opened it. Inside were strange-smelling herbs, strips of dried bark, and a lump of pine gum. "For the coughing," Asa said, his voice just as rough as before. Ada struggled to sit up. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why are you helping us?" Asa looked at her, his gaze intense. He looked at her daughters, then back to her. "Because they came to me," he said, "and because you're still here." He left as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind the scent of pine and a question that hung in the air like smoke. He hadn't just brought them medicine. He had brought them a mystery. Ada didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but she had a terrifying feeling that her husband's perfect, tidy suicide was about to get very, very messy. Asa started coming every few days after that. He never stayed long. He'd appear like a ghost at the edge of the livery, leave a package of food or a bundle of herbs, and disappear back into the hills. He spoke in clipped, practical sentences. "This is bed straw, good for fever," or "sit her upright, helps the lungs drain." The girls started to heal first. The haunted, starved look left their eyes. They even started to play again, chasing each other around the back of the shed. But Ida's recovery was slower. The herbs helped. There was no doubt about that. The coughing fits became less violent, and the blood started to disappear. But as her body got stronger, her mind started racing. Who was this man? Why was he risking the town's suspicion to help the family of the man who supposedly destroyed it? Cedar Bluff was a small town. Secrets didn't stay secret for long, and sure enough, the town noticed. Mrs. Holler, the seamstress with a face like a clenched fist, made a point of marching past the livery and announcing to anyone who would listen, "She's got a wild man visiting her now. An Indian, I hear, feeding her like a stray dog. No wonder her husband turned out to be a thief." The poison spread fast. The next Sunday, the Reverend gave a sermon about the decay of decency and the dangers of inviting savagery into a civilized town. He didn't use Eda's name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. The whispers followed the girls everywhere. They were outcasts before, but now they were something worse. They were collaborators. One evening, after Asa had dropped off a small sack of cornmeal, Ida finally asked him the question that had been burning in her mind. "Do they talk about you like this too?" Asa was sharpening a knife on a whetstone. He didn't look up. "They used to." "What happened?" Ida pressed. He finally stopped, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I was a scout for the army during the war." Ida was stunned. "Then they should be thanking you. You fought for them." A dark, humorless smile touched his lips for a fraction of a second. "They don't remember what doesn't fit their story," he said. Ida knew exactly what he meant. "I was the wife of the man who kept the books," she said softly. "Now I'm the shadow of every dollar he supposedly stole." Asa nodded slowly. "We both walk with names heavier than our feet." His answer didn't solve the mystery, but it forged a connection between them. They were two ghosts, haunted by the town's convenient stories. A few nights later, there was a knock on the shed door. It wasn't Asa. It was Sheriff Callum, his belly straining the buttons of his shirt, his gold star pinned on crooked. "Evening, Miss Vaughn," he said, trying to sound friendly. "Folks are getting nervous, saying you've got visitors of the, wrong sort." Ida didn't bother to stand. "The wrong sort for what, Sheriff? For starving quietly?" The sheriff shifted his weight. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Just keep things quiet. Don't go stirring up feelings." Ida let out a dry, rasping cough. "If a man sharing a loaf of bread stirs up feelings in this town," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "then maybe this town needs to find some different feelings." The sheriff mumbled something and left, but Ida felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He hadn't been warning her. He had been threatening her. When Asa came the next day, she told him about the sheriff's visit. Asa's face remained a stone mask, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. He didn't say anything about the sheriff. Instead, he handed her a small carved wooden pipe and a bundle of dried willow leaves. "For the lungs," he said. As Ida took it, her fingers brushed his. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a strange warmth to it. "Why are you really helping me, Asa?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. Asa's gaze drifted to where Tansy and Merritt were drawing in the dirt. His expression softened, just for a second. "Years ago," he began, his voice low, "a man from this town was traveling west. His wagon broke an axle in the middle of nowhere. He was out of water. His horse was lame. He was going to die." Ada held her breath. "I found him," Asa continued. "I gave him water, helped him fix his wagon, and showed him the safe way through the pass. He offered to pay me, but I refused. He said he was in my debt." A terrible dawning realization began to creep over Ida. "He told me his name was Harlan Vaughn." The air in the tiny shed suddenly felt thin, electric. Her husband, the man the town called a thief, the man who had apparently saved his family from beyond the grave. "Harlan didn't steal that money, Ida," Asa said, his voice firm, certain. "He found out who did, and they killed him for it." Ida felt the dirt floor shift beneath her. Everything she thought she knew, the suicide, the shame, the guilt, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed lie to cover up a murder. "Who?" she breathed. "Who killed him?" "I don't know yet," Asa admitted. "But Harlan was smart. He kept two sets of books, the fake ones they found in his office and the real ones. He told me he hid them." Suddenly the sheriff's visit made a terrifying kind of sense. He wasn't worried about an Indian visiting her. He was worried about what she might know or what she might find. The town wasn't just cruel, it was guilty. And they were terrified that the ghost of Harlan Vaughn was about to come back and drag them all to hell. Ada looked at her daughters, then at the strange, silent man who had just blown her world apart for the second time. She wasn't just fighting sickness anymore. She was fighting for her husband's name. She was in the middle of a war she didn't even know had been declared. And the enemy wasn't just a few gossiping townspeople. The enemy was the town itself. The enemy had a badge. And they thought she was a weak, dying woman who was all alone. They were wrong. The revelation that Harlan had been murdered changed everything. The weakness Ida had felt for months was burned away by a cold, hard rage. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. She and Asa began to talk in hushed tones whenever he visited, trying to piece together the puzzle of Harlan's last days. He mentioned the grain dealer, Asa recalled one afternoon. A man named Kenny. Said his numbers never added up. Ida remembered Mr. Kenny, a big, hearty man who always had a smile for everyone, but whose eyes were as cold and dead as a winter sky. He was one of the first to publicly condemn Harlan after he died. Of course he was. Harlan told me he hid the real ledger, Asa said. Somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever think to look. They went over it again and again. Where would a meticulous accountant hide the most important document of his life? Not in his house, not in his office. Both had been torn apart by the bank. Ada racked her brain, trying to remember conversations, little details she might have missed. He had a small lockbox, she said suddenly, a little metal one. He kept personal things in it. I never knew what. He always said it was for emergencies. Where is it? Asa asked, his voice urgent. Ida's face fell. It was buried with him. The town, in a final act of spite, had refused Harlan a proper burial in the church cemetery. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Potter's Field, a desolate patch of land for the unwanted and the unknown, a place no one ever went, the perfect hiding spot. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, two shadows moved through the graveyard. Asa dug while Ida held the lantern, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. The sound of the shovel hitting the cheap pine coffin was like a gunshot in the silence. Asa pried the lid open, and there it was. Resting on Harlan's chest was a small metal lockbox, already corroded from the damp earth. Ida's hands trembled as she took it. Back in the shed, they forced the lock. Inside wasn't a ledger. It was a single folded piece of paper. Harlan's familiar, neat handwriting filled the page. It wasn't a confession. It was a list of transactions, dates, and names. At the top of the list, clear as day, was Mr. Kenny, the grain dealer. But it was the name at the bottom that made Ida's blood run cold. The final, largest illegal transfer of funds was signed off, approved, and authorized by Sheriff Callum. The conspiracy was bigger than they imagined. It wasn't just a greedy businessman. The town's highest lawman was in on it. He was the enforcer, the one who guaranteed no one would ever look too closely. He was the one who had declared Harlan's death a suicide, closing the case before it was ever really opened. Ida felt a fresh wave of nausea, but this time it wasn't from sickness. It was from the sheer scale of the betrayal. The entire town hadn't just been robbed. It had been gaslit, manipulated into hating the one man who tried to save it. And they had made his innocent family pay the price. What do we do? Ida whispered, staring at the paper. We can't take this to the sheriff. No, Asa agreed, his voice grim. We can't use their law, so we have to use ours. He stood up and walked towards a small satchel he always carried. From it, he pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it carefully on the dirt floor. It was another book, a ledger. This isn't Harlan's, Etta said, confused. No, Asa said. This is mine. He opened it. The pages were filled not with numbers, but with names, dates, and locations. It was a detailed record of his time as a scout. He flipped towards the back. After the war, he said, I didn't stop scouting, but I wasn't working for the army anymore. I worked for myself. I tracked men who didn't want to be found. He tapped a page. Last winter, I tracked a man across 3 states. A bounty hunter. A hired gun. He was good, but I was better. Ida looked at the entry. It described the man, his habits, his last known location. And then, at the bottom, a single sentence. Target acquired. Contract fulfilled. You! You killed him, Ida whispered, horrified and fascinated. He was a murderer, Asa said flatly, and he was carrying this. He reached into his satchel again and pulled out a third ledger. This one was thick, leather-bound, and Ida recognized it immediately. It was the Cedar Bluff town ledger, the one Harlan had kept, the real one. The man I tracked, Asa said, was the one Kenny and Callum hired to kill your husband and forge the books. They paid him to disappear, but I found him, and I took this back. Ida stared at the book, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the proof, the weapon they needed. But it came from a dead man's hands, delivered by a killer who now stood in her home. She looked at Asa, truly looked at him, and saw the truth. He hadn't just stumbled upon her daughters in the woods. He hadn't just been repaying an old debt to her husband. He had come to Cedar Bluff for a reason. He had been hunting. Harlan's murder had set him on a path of vengeance, and it had led him right to her door. The wild man from the hills wasn't just a hermit. He was an executioner, and he had just handed her a loaded gun. The question was, did she have the guts to pull the trigger? She thought about her daughters, sleeping peacefully just a few feet away. She thought about the spit on her porch, the hunger in their bellies, the shame in their eyes. The answer was yes. Oh, yes. She would pull the trigger and burn their whole rotten world to the ground. The ledger was a bomb, and Ida knew they had to be careful about how and when they detonated it. A direct confrontation was suicide. Sheriff Callum and Mr. Kenny were not just thieves, they were murderers. They had the power, the money, and the town's blind trust. If Ida and Asa walked into the sheriff's office with that book, they'd never walk out. The ledger would disappear, and so would they. Two more unfortunate suicides to sweep under the rug. No, they couldn't fight them on their territory. They had to change the battlefield. They used the town's opinion to destroy my family, Ida said, her voice low and hard as she stared into the dying fire in her shed. So we'll use it to destroy them. Her plan started with a simple, almost revolutionary act. She was going to bake bread. Asa looked at her, confused. Bread? They made us scavenge from their trash, she explained. They made us feel less than human. They starved us. So I'm going to feed them. I'm going to bake the best bread this town has ever tasted. I'll sell it for next to nothing. I'll even give it away. I'm going to remind them what real nourishment feels like, what kindness feels like. I'm going to make them dependent on me, the woman they threw away. It was a brilliant strategy. It was psychological warfare disguised as a bakery. Asa saw the genius in it immediately. He used what little money he had to buy her the first sacks of flour, not from Cedar Bluff, but from a trading post 2 towns over. They built a small, crude clay oven behind the shed, working by moonlight, and then one morning a smell began to drift through the alleys of Cedar Bluff. A smell the town hadn't experienced in a very long time. The warm, rich, life-affirming scent of baking bread. At first, no one came. They were suspicious, but the smell was intoxicating, and Ida's prices were too low to ignore. Children, drawn by the scent, were the first to brave the invisible line the town had drawn around the Vaughn property. Ida gave them warm slices for free. They ran home, and soon their parents followed, clutching a few pennies, their faces a mixture of hunger and shame. Ida didn't preach. She didn't accuse. She just sold her bread. She was polite, efficient, and distant. She took their money, but she refused to take their apologies or meet their guilty eyes. And it drove them crazy. Mrs. Holler, the seamstress, was the first to crack. "It's a trick," she screeched in the general store. "She's trying to poison us all with her Indian bread." But it was too late. Ida's bread was too good. The town was hooked. She was no longer Ida Vaughn, the disgraced widow. She was the bread lady. She was becoming essential, and that made her powerful. Sheriff Callum and Mr. Kenny watched this transformation with growing unease. They couldn't stop her. What were they going to do? Arrest a woman for baking? They saw her getting stronger, saw the town's attitude slowly shifting from hatred to a grudging respect. and it made them nervous. One evening, the sheriff paid her another visit. This time, he didn't bother with fake pleasantries. "What's your game, Ida?" he growled. "No game, Sheriff," she replied calmly, not looking up from her kneading. "Just earning a living, something my husband was trying to do before he was murdered." The sheriff's face went pale. He took a step closer. "You watch your mouth. Accidents happen. Fires start." It was a direct threat. The air crackled with tension. But just as he took another step, a shadow detached itself from the side of the shed. It was Asa. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, holding a skinning knife, his eyes locked on the sheriff. The message was clear. You touch her, you die. The sheriff, for all his bluster, was a coward. He backed away, spitting a curse into the dirt, and left. But Ada knew the threat was real. They were cornered animals, and they were about to get desperate. The next move had to be the final one. The plan was set for Sunday, church. The one place where the entire town would be gathered. The one place where Mr. Kenny and Sheriff Callum felt completely safe, surrounded by the flock they had so expertly fleeced. Ida spent all of Saturday baking, not bread, but dozens of small sweet buns. When Asa asked why, she just smiled grimly. "The Last Supper," she said. On Sunday morning, Ida walked into the church for the first time in over a year. She wasn't wearing rags. She wore her best dress, a simple blue one she had saved. Her daughters walked on either side of her, their heads held high. The whole congregation turned to stare. Whispers filled the sanctuary like rustling leaves. Etta ignored them all and took a seat in the back pew. She waited through the entire service, through the hymns and the prayers and Reverend Mary's sermon on the evils of greed. The irony was so thick she could have choked on it. Finally, at the end of the service, as people were beginning to shuffle out, Ida stood up. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that stunned the crowd into silence. She walked to the front of the church, holding a basket filled with the sweet buns. Mr. Kenny and Sheriff Callum, sitting in the front pew like kings, looked at her with pure hatred. "A year ago," Ida began, her voice steady, "this town condemned my husband, Harlan Vaughn, as a thief. You destroyed his name, and you left his family to starve. You did this because you were told to, because the men you trusted told you it was the truth." She looked directly at Kenny and Callum. "Today, I'm here to tell you that you were lied to." A gasp went through the crowd. Reverend Mary started to protest, but Ada held up a hand. "My husband didn't steal your money. He discovered who did. He was murdered in his office to keep him quiet, and his death was staged to look like a suicide by the very man paid to protect you." She pointed a trembling finger at Sheriff Callum. "And the man who orchestrated it all, the man who got rich off your trust and your hard work, is sitting right there." She pointed at Mr. Kenny. The grain dealer leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is slander. She's a crazy, grieving woman." The sheriff put his hand on his gun. "Everyone stay calm. This woman is hysterical." But Ida wasn't finished. "You don't have to believe me," she said, her voice rising, "but maybe you'll believe this." And from the back of the church, Asa stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't holding a knife. He was holding the thick, leather-bound town ledger. He walked slowly down the aisle and placed it on the altar. "This," Ida declared, "is the real town ledger, the one Harlan hid before he was killed. It details every single dollar Mr. Kenny stole and every bribe Sheriff Callum took to cover it up. It's all in there, in Harlan's own hand." Panic erupted. The sheriff drew his gun, but he was too slow. Several men from the congregation, farmers who had lost everything, surged forward and tackled him. Mr. Kenny tried to make a run for it, but he was surrounded. The town, finally realizing the depth of the betrayal, turned on them like a pack of wolves. It was swift, brutal justice. They weren't arrested. They were dragged out of the church and run out of town on a rail, battered and broken. The lie was finally dead. In the chaos, Ada stood quietly by the altar. She picked up the ledger and held it to her chest. It was over. She had won. She had cleared her husband's name. She looked at Asa, who was standing by the door, watching. He gave her a single, slow nod. Recognition, respect. That night, as the town celebrated its liberation, Ada and her family had a quiet meal in their small shed. Asa was with them. He had brought a small carved wooden bird. Its wings were spread wide, as if it was just about to take flight. For the new beginning, he said. Ada took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. The town had been reborn, and so had she. She was no longer a ghost, haunted by the past. She was Ada Vaughn, and she was finally free. But the story doesn't end there. Because as Ada held that ledger, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Tucked into the very last page was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It wasn't in Harlan's handwriting. It was a letter. And as she read the first line, she realized this conspiracy went deeper than she could ever have imagined. It hadn't started with Mr. Kenny. It had started a generation before. The letter was from Harlan's father to Mr. Kenny's father. And it was a confession. A confession to the first time the town's funds had been stolen 20 years earlier. Harlan hadn't just uncovered a crime. He had uncovered a legacy of corruption. And the letter proved that another, even more respected family in town had been in on it from the very beginning. The family of Reverend Mary, the man who had just watched his parishioners deliver justice, was as guilty as the rest of them. The rot went all the way to the heart of the town, to the pulpit itself. Ada looked up from the letter, her blood running cold. She had cut off the head of the snake, but the body was still writhing, hidden right in plain sight. And now it knew she had the proof. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The silence that fell in the shed after Ada read that letter was heavier than any stone. Asa, seeing the look on her face, came closer. He read the letter over her shoulder, his expression hardening into granite. The Reverend, the man of God, the moral compass of Cedar Bluff, was the root of the whole poison tree. His father had started the scheme with Kenny's father, and the sons had simply continued the family business. It was a dynasty of thieves, hiding behind scripture and starched collars. This explained why Reverend Mary had been so quick to condemn Harlan and so vicious in his sermons against Ada. He wasn't just kicking a woman when she was down. He was bearing a threat. He was terrified Harlan had passed the truth on to his wife. "They won't run," Asa said, his voice a low growl. "Kenny and Callum were cowards. Mary is a true believer. He believes God is on his side. He'll see this as a test, and he will fight back." Ada knew he was right. They had exposed the muscle and the money, but they hadn't exposed the soul of the corruption, and the soul was far more dangerous. The next few days were quiet, eerily quiet. The town was buzzing with the downfall of the sheriff and the grain dealer, but Reverend Mary remained untouched, untouchable. He delivered a tearful sermon the following Sunday, lamenting how his dear friends had been led astray by the devil, and how the town must now pray for healing and forgiveness. It was a masterful performance. He was positioning himself as the town's savior, the one to guide them through the darkness he himself had created. Ada knew she couldn't use the same tactic twice. She couldn't just stand up in church again and present another piece of paper. The town was exhausted, confused. They wouldn't believe it. They would see her as a vengeful woman trying to tear down their last pillar of stability. She had to be smarter. She had to set a trap. She continued baking her bread, but now there was a new purpose to it. Her small stand behind the livery became the town's new center. People came not just for food, but for news, for gossip, for a sense of community that the hollowed-out church could no longer provide. Ada listened more than she talked, gathering whispers, learning the town's secrets. Meanwhile, Asa started moving in the shadows. He disappeared for days at a time, riding out to the surrounding counties. He was a scout, after all. He was gathering intelligence. He learned that Reverend Mary's church was part of a larger synod, a regional body that oversaw a dozen parishes. The Reverend answered to a bishop in Helena, a man with a reputation for being stern and fanatically devoted to purity in his clergy. This was the weakness they were looking for. Mary wasn't a king. He was a middle manager, and he had a boss. The trap was simple, but it required perfect timing. Ada wrote 2 letters. The first was to Bishop Miller in Helena. In it, she laid out the entire story, from Harlan's murder to the Reverend's generational corruption. She included a precise, hand-drawn copy of the confession letter from Mary's father. She told the bishop that she had the original, and that she intended to reveal it to the entire town during the upcoming Harvest Festival service, a major event that the bishop himself was scheduled to attend. It was a direct challenge. She was forcing his hand, making it impossible for him to ignore. The second letter was anonymous, and it was for Reverend Mary. It was short and brutal. I know what your father did. The bishop is coming. Confess, or I will burn you down in front of him. She had Asa leave it in the church collection plate. The effect was immediate. A new kind of fear gripped the Reverend. It was no longer the fear of being exposed to a town he could manipulate. It was the fear of being judged by a power higher than himself. He became erratic, his sermons growing more fiery and desperate. He started preaching about the evils of false witnesses and serpents in the garden, his eyes constantly scanning the congregation, looking for the source of the threat. He was coming unglued. The Harvest Festival arrived on a crisp autumn day. The whole town was there, and so was Bishop Miller, a tall, imposing figure with eyes that seemed to see right through you. He sat in the front pew, his face an unreadable mask. Ida, her daughters, and Asa sat in the back. Ida could feel the tension in the air. It was so thick she could taste it. Reverend Mary took the pulpit. He was sweating, his hands trembling as he gripped the sides of the lectern. He began his sermon, his voice cracking. He talked about sin, about weakness, about how even the most righteous man can fall. It was a strange, meandering speech. It was a confession, disguised as a sermon. He was trying to soften the ground, to control the narrative before it could be used against him. But Ida had no intention of letting him. Just as he was reaching his climax, talking about the need for grace and forgiveness, Ida stood up. A collective gasp went through the church. Reverend, she said, her voice calm and clear, before you ask for forgiveness, shouldn't you tell them what you're asking forgiveness for? The bishop turned his head and stared at Ida. The reverend's face contorted in a mask of rage and terror. This woman is a liar. She is the serpent I warned you of. But his panic was a confession in itself. Bishop Miller stood up, his voice booming through the silent church. Reverend Mary, this woman wrote to me. She has made some very serious allegations. She claims to have proof. The reverend started to babble, to deny everything, but the bishop cut him off. She claims to have a letter written by your own father. Is this true? All eyes were on the reverend. He was trapped. He looked from the bishop's stony face to Ida's calm, determined one. He saw the faces of his congregation, no longer filled with adoration, but with dawning suspicion, and he broke. He collapsed at the pulpit, sobbing, confessing everything. The theft, the cover-up, his father's sins, his own. It all came pouring out in a pathetic, wretched flood. Justice this time was swift and formal. Bishop Miller excommunicated Mary on the spot, stripped him of his position, and promised the church would pay back every last stolen dollar. The last pillar of the old rotten cedar bluff had crumbled into dust. As Ida walked out of the church into the bright autumn sunshine, she felt a lightness she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the feeling of victory, it was the feeling of a heavy weight, a name that wasn't hers, finally being lifted from her shoulders. Asa was waiting for her, a rare, small smile on his face. It's done, he said. No, Ida replied, taking his hand. It's begun. In the months that followed, Cedar Bluff began to heal. A new reverend arrived, a young, honest man who helped the community rebuild its trust. The Vaughn name was cleared, restored to its former respectability. But Ada didn't want the old life back. She had built something new, something that was hers. The Vaughn Oven, as the sign now proudly read, became the heart of the new town. She eventually built a small house on the same plot of land, with a real kitchen and a warm hearth. Asa built the door. He never moved in, but his cabin in the hills was slowly abandoned as he spent more and more time by her fire. He became a fixture in their lives, a quiet, steady presence. Uncle Asa to the girls, and something more to Ida, something that didn't need a name. They were a strange, scarred, but unbreakable family, forged in fire and lies and stronger for it. They had faced down the worst a town had to offer, and had not only survived, but had triumphed. They had taken a legacy of ruin and built a home. This story is a powerful reminder that the truth can be buried, but it rarely stays buried forever. And sometimes the most unassuming people have the strength to unearth it. If you believe that one person's courage can change the world, and if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button. And if you want to hear more stories about justice being served and secrets being brought into the light, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You never know what truths we might uncover together. Thanks for watching.